Hey guys, this is Miss McFadden and I want to give you a quick refresher on how to write the DBQ. Make sure that you have a pen and paper ready in case you need to take notes, but of course you can come back and watch this video multiple times if you'd like. First and foremost, what is contextualization? A couple of things to note about contextualization. It should be 3 to 4 content or fact-rich analytical sentences. In other words, it should include specific details. So, for example, you want to describe events or processes or trends that happened before the time period of the question or in another region that's relevant. So, for example, if you are talking about imperialism in India, you could talk about the British and what was going on politically with them in Europe. Another example would be if you are talking about post-classical East Asia, then maybe something in post-classical Europe and Africa could be relevant. But if you're discussing what's going on globally. Whatever you do, make a connection to the question that is asked. Information cannot be random. You may not simply spew out unrelated facts. That is a huge mistake that a lot of students do. You do not want to do that. Okay. Whatever you give me as far as contextualization goes, you have to discuss why does this matter to the question that's at hand? How will this information lead into your thesis? So let's look at an example. Your goal is to situate your question to your answer to the question rather, for the DBQ or LEQ among historical events, developments, processes within the broader regional, national, or global context in which they occurred. That means that your contextualization is the lead-in. This is what the reader needs to know to understand the historical significance of the topic. So, for example, what if your sample prompt was evaluate to what extent European exploration was driven by political considerations between 1450 to 1750? What is it that you want to let the reader know? Imagine I don't know anything about this topic. Well, you would want to start a little broader and then narrow down until you lead into the thesis statement. So these are two different views. We have the upside down triangle that we've talked about before, but there's also the circular image that some people find more useful. Either way, your thesis is going to be on European exploration. So big picture, you probably want to start with talking about the Crusades, what that was, and the enduring distrust of Muslims by Europeans. Then narrowing down, it is relevant to talk about the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453 and how that resulted in increased taxation of goods. Together, this idea of Europeans not liking Muslims, plus the Muslims taxing the Europeans extra money for goods, would lead into your thesis on European exploration, and in which you would tell us the reasons why they were exploring. Okay, maybe the causes, maybe the effects, so on and so forth. So again, big picture, narrowing down a little bit, and then straight into the thesis statement. For any prompt, make sure to give the background information necessary for the reader to understand the setting. Be vague and the reader remains confused. So again, be specific. This is the sample prompt that you guys did a practice LEQ on. Evaluate to what extent the major trade networks were similar in the period 1200 to 1450. Look at this contextualization. It's followed up by the thesis so you can see what the whole first paragraph would look like. Do you think this would get the contextualization? Yeah or nah? There were many trade networks in the time period 1200 to 1450. These trade networks saw a lot of goods being traded on them. There were also technologies that spread too. Major empires traded on them. The major trade networks were the Silk Road's Indian Ocean Trade Network and the Trans-Saharan Trade Network. I'll give you a few seconds to consider. If your answer is nah, you would be correct. There are too many vague sentences in here. What about this one? In the period 1200 to 1450, the ancient trade networks, such as the Silk Roads and the Indian Ocean Trade Network, were at the height of their success. The Romans and Persians had traded on these routes in the classical era. In the post-classical era, the trans-Saharan trade route developed through the adoption of the camel from Central Asia. In the 13th century, Mongol protection of the Silk Roads and Mali's protection of the trans-Saharan trade route and state sponsorship of rest areas limited the threats from bandits, making it increasingly safe for travelers. As a result, not only goods were traded on the trade networks. Would this get the contextualization point? Yeah or nah? I'll give you a couple of seconds to consider. If you say yeah, that would be correct. On the next slide, we're going to look at the same information broken down. So starting within the period 1200 to 1450, all the way to increasingly safe for travelers, or rather on the trade networks, that is your contextualization and that would get the point. A couple of reasons for that. It is a little bit more specific. It tells us that the Romans and Persians had already been trading on these trade routes. You mentioned that the trans-Saharan trade route is a newer one, and the reason it developed was because of the adoption of the camel. And you talk about the Mongol protection of the Silk Roads and the Mali's protection of trans-Saharan route. That provides the setting, as well as state sponsorship of rest areas. So now I have an idea of what is going on in these trade routes, how long they've existed. And so when we talk about the trade routes, I have that background. Very, very important, you need to have a hinge sentence. This is the sentence that links the contextualization with the thesis statement. In this case, it was, as a result, not only goods were traded on the trade networks. That leads into the thesis statement. Although the Silk Roads and the Indian Ocean trade routes required the use of different technologies and innovations, the Indian Ocean trade routes and Silk Roads had some similarity in the products being traded. However, the most significant similarity was the diffusion of culture by missionaries and merchants along the trade routes. This hinge sentence helps us to understand that items other than products were being traded. This diffusion of culture, technologies, innovations, this really nicely connects to what the reader or writer rather had written in the contextualization. Do note this thesis statement uses the thesis formula, although x, comma, y, however, my. Some do's and don'ts of contextualization. Do find information from the time period of the prompt or leading into the time period of the prompt. Don't go further back than that because it won't count. So in the example we just used about the post-classical era, the trade routes in 1200 to 1450, if you started talking about ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia, that would not count. The furthest back you can go into would be the Romans and Persians, because that was the time period before the one we're talking about. Also, make sure you go broad, but not vague. An example here would be empires controlled trade routes versus the Mongols controlled the Silk Roads. One is more specific, but big picture. Do not be Captain Obvious. Folks, please don't give me information that is so obvious that anyone could have written that. If a third grader could write that, then it's probably too obvious. Don't repeat details from the contextualization as evidence or outside evidence later on. Don't forget to add the hinge sentence to tie contextualization to the thesis. At the reading last year, we noticed that students weren't doing that and they would not get the contextualization point, even though the contextualization itself was really good. And then do not put thesis words or claim within the contextualization. A common mistake I see is that students will start talking about the thesis within the contextualization. No, you got to keep them separate and make sure you add that hint sentence in. What about document summary and support and outside evidence? So a couple of things to keep in mind. Document summary is just as it sounds. You provide a brief summary of the document, mentioning the aspects that are relevant to the claim you are making. Document support simply means using the document as your evidence to support your claim. In an LEQ, you would have to bring the evidence. In the DBQ, the document provides the evidence, but you do have to analyze it. So it's really simple. Think about discussing something political with someone. You reference an article you read. You give a quick summary of what it said, and then you use it to prove your claim. That is what you are doing within a document-based essay. The documents are your evidence. Here we're using document 5 from the Mongols DBQ that you practiced with. The prompt was evaluate how the settled societies of Eurasia viewed or responded to the Mongols. So you have the document here, and I'm showing you the claim, the document summary, and the doc support. One way Eurasians responded to the Mongols was through increased trade and exchange. That's your claim. Then Marco Polo reported that in Tabriz, a famous center on the Silk Road, merchants came all the way from Italy, that's what they refer to here as Latin, to make profits off of goods that came from distant lands. Notice here that we did not summarize the entire document. We just quickly went to a part of it that will lead us to discussing our support. And our support says, his description of Mongols punishing bandits severely would certainly encourage travelers to make the journey with their precious goods, as they didn't have to worry about being robbed or killed. Thus, there was an increase in trade under the Mongols. So we have the document summary, a little bit of analysis, and then we show how that ties back to your claim. So again, think of it this way. You have your claim, you have your evidence, and then you have your commentary that takes the evidence and ties it back to the claim. What if you were to add an outside evidence here? So this is exactly the same as what we just read, but then at the end, you have an outside evidence. In fact, this era was called the Pax Mongolica because increased safety of travelers on the roads, the Mongols controlled what ensured they could tax more of them, and that would increase their wealth. You will notice, if you go back to your Mongols DBQ, that there were no mention of the Pax Mongolica. So this would serve as an outside evidence. It also ties it back to the claim. What you don't want to do is just mention Pax Mongolica and not make any connections. Also, keep in mind, you only have to have one piece of relevant outside evidence in your entire essay. I would say do two. That way you can kind of cover your, you can hedge your bets. Your DBQ prompt will utilize the change in continuity skill. A change can happen anytime in the time period, but continuity is there in the beginning and in the end and never went away. Please keep this in mind. When you are discussing change, provide change from and change to in order for it to count. Last but not least, the thesis formula options. You will notice with your LEQ, I gave you this as well. Okay, you could either give me a straight thesis statement, 3 changes, one being more significant than the others, or 3 continuities, one being more significant than the others. Or you can give me the complex split thesis with the counter argument. That's your although x, comma, y, however, my. The x is the counter argument. Your y is the argument. Major argument is the my. So say you decide to give me 1 continuity and 2 changes. The continuity is your x, your counter argument. Or if you give me 1 change and 2 continuities, your x is your change. Last but not least, do not quote. Whatever you do, do not quote from any of the documents. You will immediately not get credit for your document support or your document description or summary. Hopefully this was helpful. Good luck.